Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all right. Today, we begin a project that will take some time to explain why we believe, why we belong to a community called a church, why we do what we do and say what we say, and to do so in a way that is intelligible to everyone, not shrouded in theological conundrums or incomprehensible language. It's a huge question that every one of us has to ask ourselves in the silence of our own souls every day. Now, earlier on in these reflections, last February in fact, we spoke about belonging to a church and whether it has any future in its present form, asking the question, is this the church that our Lord wanted and wants? And if not, what might we do about it? And we want to also not just answer those questions or try to answer them, but to engage people in the process of finding out more about our faith and what it means for us. And so we need to proceed honestly and humbly and not be afraid to answer uncomfortable questions, even if we can't answer them. So this is going to be called I Have My Mission, as I spoke to you about at the weekend and wrote in the newsletter. It's words taken from Cardinal Newman. So, if we're to discover what my mission, yours and mine, is, namely what God is asking of me today, what many other matters need to be addressed first. Who is God? What does it mean to believe in him? What might a life with someone I cannot see be like? Does it make any sense at all? Who am I? What has happened to me? What shapes me? What are my dreams and hopes for myself, for my family, for today and in the future? What influences me for good or ill? And if this is a loving God, as people claim, why does he let suffering happen and not take it away? Why do horrible things still happen? Why do people still hurt and destroy each other? Why are so many poor, homeless and hungry? Is he a God of judgment or compassion? So these are some of the basic questions, and there are many, many more we could and might ask, like what is the connection between faith in God and belonging to a church, practicing our faith in celebrating the Mass and living according to its teachings? The letter I wrote to you recently on Pentecost Sunday and mentioned last weekend outlines some of the problems that we've been experiencing in latter years and from which we cannot hide. The truth is painful, but we must face it. Many people now sit very lightly to the practice of their faith, and yet they expect the baptism and first communion of their children as a right or entitlement. But how can you baptize children into a community to which their parents do not belong or have ever been part of? How can you give Holy Communion to children who've never been in a church and celebrated the Mass previously? And sometimes people claim that the children are being punished by their priest because of their parents' lack of faith and commitment. Whereas in fact it's the parents who are punishing them, if you will, by not bringing them into the life and prayer of our Lord's family. And there are many reasons for this, as we've said. And clearly the connection between what is perceived as faith and church-going has been broken. The Irish priest-writer, Father Brian Darcy, has a weekly column in an Irish newspaper called The Sunday World. It's a bit like the News of the World used to be here, and it contains all sorts of seedy details about gang warfare, murder, drug running, as well as many unsavoury elements of our lives which we would prefer not to admit and certainly don't need to go into here. And I admire him for writing for this publication, because in so doing, he ensures that very many people will read what he has to say, even if it is in this unlikely context, and they may never have heard those words before. This weekend, he spoke of the results of a survey that he had asked his readers as to whether they felt that the church in Ireland is worth saving. He was rather taken aback by the volume of replies informing him that it was not worth saving. As he comments, readers who still consider themselves honest Catholics are so disillusioned with the clerical church that they think nothing can happen until it is dismantled. It is a necessary prerequisite for the revitalization of the faith, they say. How did we get to this point, he asked. In the late 80s and early 90s, the true horror of the clerical child abuse scandal was evident. It allowed people to express their anger at the hypocrisy of the leaders in the Catholic Church. Millions stopped going to church, and many left the church altogether. Essentially, people had a right to be angry, and they knew it. Now, I don't think any of us would disagree with that. And indeed, it is surely the feeling of many people here as well. But it is not the whole story, as Father Darcy points out when he says, "We now know that it shouldn't have devastated their faith. If their faith was based on a personal relationship with a loving God, the sins of mere clerics would not have destroyed it. On the contrary, their faith was built on culture and habit. And when the culture collapsed, their faith collapsed with it." He commented that there are sex abuse scandals in the BBC, in schools, residential communities, football association, scouts, and many other places. But this has not stopped people watching television or going to school or playing or watching football. Furthermore, he says, in recent years, the anger has dissipated to be replaced by something infinitely more dangerous, apathy and indifference. Many couldn't care less what clerics think or do, and now use the church as and when it suits them, he said. God, likewise, flits in and out of their lives without influencing how they live or act. And probably the biggest example of indifference, though, is our inability to see evil as evil. It's well put, Father Brian tells us, by the writer Reinhold Niebuhr, who says that we preach a God without anger, who leads men without sin, to a kingdom without judgment, through a Christ without a cross. That is indifference. We need to hold up a mirror to ourselves and to our beliefs so that we can see ourselves as we really are. As one of the two executors of Father Terry's will, I've spent a good deal of time going through his personal effects, especially his books, many of which demonstrate what was in his mind in his latter years. There is a book written in 2015 by Father Jonathan Cotton of our diocese called Evangelizing the Baptized, referring to the fact that many people have been brought up in a faith that they do not actually profess or know about or live by themselves. Hence the need to go back to the beginning and almost preach that faith to them all over again, which is roughly what I've been trying to do and continue to do with you here. And then there's another book called Clericalism, on how the elitism of the clergy has prevented Christ's church becoming what the Vatican Council proclaimed that it is, the people of God. And finally, one I found the other day, a very interesting book by an Irish Jesuit, Father Philip Fogarty, called The Missing God Who Is Not Missed, in which he quotes a fellow Jesuit, Father Josep Vives, in his introduction. What characterizes the present moment is that the question of God remains irrelevant, or even non-existent for the great majority of people. God is missing, but not missed. That is a genuinely new situation which never existed in the world before. Now, the irrelevance of God and the detachment of faith from being part of a church community is a topic which Pope Francis spoke of in one of the early homilies of his ministry. He said, Catholics can't put their faith on a part-time schedule or rely on it just for the moments they choose. Being a Christian is a full-time occupation. How many people pay a dear price for being committed to the truth? How many honest men and women prefer going against the tide in order not to reject the voice of their conscience, the voice of truth? There are more Christians being imprisoned or killed today than in the early centuries of the church. Whilst these martyrs represent the greatest example of giving one's life to Christ, there are also everyday martyrs who are not killed, but who lose their lives for Jesus by giving up their own egos and desires to serve others. Among these martyrs of every day are mothers and fathers who put their faith into practice by concretely offering their life for the well-being of the family. Priests and religious men and women, too, generously serve God's kingdom, as do young people who selflessly dedicate themselves to caring for children, those who are disabled, elderly, and others. There was a wonderful editorial in the Catholic magazine The Tablet for November the 23rd, 2013, not long after Pope Francis was elected, which tried to explain his vision and thinking. And it says, "The plan that Pope Francis wants the Church to follow has been emerging piece by piece since his election in March, but now he has set it out in detail. He wants a change of the Church's culture and character, a change of its priorities, a change of its structures. He wants a church that is neither sleepwalking nor marching in step, but that goes forth into the world getting the mud of the streets on its shoes, to deliver the message of God's infinite care for every bit of it. The Pope is joyfully exhorting his flock to rethink almost everything it does in pursuit of its one key aim, evangelization. Rather than experts in dire predictions, the Pope says, doer judges bent on rooting out every threat and deviation, we should appear as joyful messengers of challenging proposals, guardians of the goodness and beauty which shine forth in a life of fidelity to the gospel. Contrary to those who equate evangelization simply with encouraging church-going, he embraces those members of the faithful who preserve a deep and sincere faith, expressing it in different ways, but seldom taking part in worship. The Church must show compassion to these people and also those who do not obey every last detail of all aspects of its moral teaching, which must mean the majority of them. This is how we evangelize them, the Pope says, and he insists that evangelizing style he wants to see is about inclusion, not exclusion. The article went on, if there is anger in the soul of Pope Francis, he does not reserve it for those whose private lives do not conform to some Catholic ideal, but towards those who exploit the poor and increase their poverty. The thirst for power and possessions knows no limits. In this system, which tends to devour everything that stands in the way of increased profits, whatever is fragile, like the environment, is defenseless before the interests of a deified market, which becomes the only rule. This is why I want a church which is poor and for the poor, the Pope says. They have much to teach us. We need to let ourselves be evangelized by them. So his model for the church is more participative and open, more decentralized and fluid, more willing to take risks, less bothered about doctrinal conformity, less clerical, but above all, Christ-centered. It is this church that we might want to belong to go to share our lives with, isn't it? So this is what we've been thinking about in particular during the pandemic. And now as we emerge into a new situation that we'd not perceived before, namely a priestless church with less people and less influence, but hopefully not a ghetto of people who cut themselves off from the realities of life, but who instead engage themselves more fully in the world in which we live as true evangelizers, as the Pope calls us. At the end of his Gospel, St. John explains why he wrote down his account of the stories of our Lord's life. These are recorded so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and that believing this you may have life through his name. Life in and through him is what we are about and always have been. It is not about me, but about him. When I was a student, a lovely Scottish priest called Father Jock Dalrymple gave us a very moving retreat, during which he said, "What the church exists to promote is personal discipleship of Jesus Christ." And so many times this year in particular, I've spoken to you about the fact that many people seem to have lost sight of the Lord and got involved in peripheral concerns, convincing themselves that they do believe without any evidence from their daily lives. We need to change our minds. There you are. I've said it yet again. We need to change our minds about everything. There is no other way, hence the purpose of these reflections. So we will proceed once again to reflect, explain, and challenge ourselves beginning next week in consideration of the arguments against God, including science, tragedy, inexplicable natural disasters, and then moving on to think about what it means to believe in and worship this God in the present climate. And if you've got any questions you would like me to consider and speak about, please do let me know, and I'll be happy to do my best to address them. God bless you all.